So welcome back. We're looking forward, B'ez Hashem, to continue the sixth chapter, the sixth epistle of the Alter Rebbe, Geras HaKodesh. We're holding on page 220. V'lachein hein nikro hanikrois b'shem emes. Maybe we'll start two lines above that. By the period there, vade inarich klal. I believe we learned this last week already. However, just get the flow. So we know the Alter Rebbe asked, he's an emes liYaakov. Yaakov is about emes, and so what does it mean giving emes to Yaakov? The Alter Rebbe, of course, begins the epistle with zerech tzedakah, secher emes, sowing tzedakah, and the reward would be emes. The simple pirush, Rashi, so there's David, and we have the Alter Rebbe's pirush that the emes itself is going to be the reward. Because there's something which is associated with true emes. There's no comparison, nothing compared to it. And the Alter Rebbe puts it into the context of Avodas Hashem, yid arousing, that rachmanis, that mercy, that compassion over his neshama, which as such gives him the ability to put things in perspective and establish this love and fear, because it's all based on what he figured out, with the human being, with the yid, with his own intellect, has developed this love and fear to HaKadosh Baruch Hu based on this meditation of the Rachmanis of the Neshama, as opposed to the Avavira which Hashem gifts the person. Abaydas Matana, it's a gift coming from Hashem, which coming from Hashem is emes. Of course, there's no comparison. Something which is developed by part of creation, even though a yid, but a yid with his own intellect, and then something coming from the Creator, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no erech to nivra. So the avavira, the love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is be'in erech. There's no comparison. Now, of course, for understanding what we just mentioned, the last minute and a half or two, one has to understand where we're coming from, what is the flow of this chapter, and for that I mentioned time and again, wherever you're watching it, there's the original website, tanyaonline.com, tanyaonline.com, where you can see all the previous classes lined up on the left side of the site. Other advantages that we say, we know periodically, but namely the fact that you can tap into all the previous classes. So this, Geras HaKodesh, to understand everything we just said, Zerech tzedakah, Zecher emes, what does it mean, emes liYaakov? You have to see it in order to appreciate it. You have to learn it, and if you're following the class, of course, you could remember everything we learned and to review. Or if you didn't follow the class up till now, it's important to tap in, a click away, to see this chapter. Also, again, as we mentioned, this is the fourth segment of the Sefer Tanya, unique in its kind. It's Igeres, as we said, mentioned also, unique and distinct from the first three segments. But you see all the segments, in other words, we merited to learn all the other parts of Tanya, the other segments, Kuti Amorim, Shaykh B'Muni, Geras HaTshuva, which also are all lined up, all the classes lined up, and we know that we have constantly cross-references from even the Geras HaKodesh to those other segments in Tanya, quite frequently. Also, sometimes we mention, to understand this idea, hop over to that chapter and to click away and to be able to appreciate it thoroughly. So this which we just mentioned, in brief, of course, this is the crux of the entire chapter. This is what the Alter Rebbe is coming and explains the midah of Yaakov on its own, the midah of Rachmanis, in Avodas Hashem. What does it mean, Rachmanis and Avodas Hashem? In our service to our Creator, as the Alter Rebbe begins, that everything has to be connected. We pointed that out also. Again, you could see in the very beginning, it's something quite fundamental, that whenever we speak about a certain midah, about an Avram, and Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or anything we relate, we highlight in Torah, it always has to reflect in our service to our Creator, for that's the whole reason why we're here, why this is the purpose of creation. Focusing on the human being himself, Ani Nivresi L'Shamash Eskeni, I was created to serve my master, or Ani Lo Nivresi, we mentioned, and also as underscored so much more, so much deeper. wasn't created solely to serve my masters. Everything has to reflect in our service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And our service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is one pondering and meditating on his neshama, the Yeridas HaNeshama, the plummet of the neshama, which comes from the uppermost levels within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Lashon and Zeir, Igir Rama Lebira Mikta, coming from the highest of mountains to the lowest of valleys, plummets to something to such a dear level. The uppermost parts of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the nethermost parts of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of all reality. In a goof, and Nefesh Bahamis again has explained and elaborated all the previous classes, all the click away. Now that's the mid of Yaakov, Rachmanis, Lashon Min HaKotzel HaKot, this idea that the highest of heights to the lowest of low, and that's where the Rachmanis comes from. The Rachmanis is also attributed to Yaakov. We mentioned Abraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gvura, spoke about it then. Towards the beginning of the chapter, Yaakov is a center, Tiferes, which is Rachmanis. The center is rooted in the highest of heights, and in the lowest of lows, if you will. And that's also an idea of emes. It's something which it's not limited to one style. We spoke about at the beginning also. Chesed is one idea. Gvura is another. The idea of Tiferes that it's a combination of both. That's why it's emes. Emes is not the famous expression of doesn't come in so strongly, but the famous Kotzker. The Kotzker said, if 99% emes is 100% sheker, because emes is all the way till the end. That's why the Gemara says emes is the first letter is aleph, mem is the center letter, and then saf is the final letter, because emes is all the way from beginning till the end, and that's why that's the uniqueness of Yaakov Avinu. Tiferes is a combination of chesed and gvura. It's not limited to one style. In other words, Mirema Mailas, Mina Kotza La Kotza, which is the idea of Rachmanis itself. But nonetheless, this Titain Emes Li Yaakov. And this is where we were holding, that something is based, there's certain arousal of pity and compassion over the neshama, which ignites a love and fear of Yitzhak HaKadosh Baruch Hu, based, predicated on his own understanding and his own pondering and meditating the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and focusing on the neshama, which is part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, chelik kamimal, and yorda ploim, that the neshama, which is a part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, plummeted to the lowest of states, and in a place in the Elam Hazeh, in a body of Shemahamis, which chas v'shalom, it could even impurify itself with the impurities and the enticing impurities which exist in Elam Hazeh. That's beyond just being situated in a place which is not its original domain, as part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but beyond that, chas v'shalom, it could fall into the real abyss, which is a shalosh gusat, or any type of impurity, because it's again sitting in a world which there's a constant vulnerability exists with that, based on the attachment to Elam Hazeh, the fact that it enters into a body, into the Bahamis, which is into an animal soul, which is well anchored in Elam Hazeh. What a great Rachmanis! Yaakov Asher Padas Abrav, doesn't say it over here in the famous. This idea is very similarly presented in the Alter Rebbe in Perik Mem Hey, in Likutei Amorim. Click away the first segment, Likutei Amorim, and there the Alter Rebbe quotes and concludes the chapter Yaakov Asher Padas Abrav. Through the midah, of course, it has the simple meaning, but the Alter Rebbe touches Yaakov, and there's a really Seidus of Rachmanis. It redeems the Avram. The Avram is the Chesed, which is Ava, the love of Yitzhak Baruch Hu, which has gone dormant prior to the Seidus of Rachamim. But through Yaakov redeems Avram, that a person be able to arouse the love and fear to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, love and eventually fear as well, and so on. But this is all based on what he builds up, the person, the human being, that is, the Yid builds up, and ultimately leads to a true, genuine love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because it's a true meditation. It's a meditation based on the truth of Lukus, the truth of godliness, the truth of Torah, and so on, focusing on his neshama. It's arousal of a neshama, which is chelik kavimal. But then there is the love and fear which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gifts the Yid, coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Avedus matona etim konascha, which is similar to Kona. Again, we spoke about this last week. So Alter Rebbe, let's see, let's begin V'hinei Vadai. So all this we said, again, it sounds maybe you can get a little bit of the flow, but to understand it thoroughly, of course, you have to see the previous classes. If you're a newcomer, to click away on the site. So the Alter Rebbe continues, it's certain that there's no comparison from the former, which is the offsprings, which is a production of the Seichel Hanivra, of the human intellect of creation, which is the human being, Legabi Achreinis, as opposed to the latter, Shema Beiris Baruch Shemai, coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No comparison. Of course there's no comparison. It's like someone saying the Aved of Yisrael to Aved of a Kain. The Kain is in the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because Hashem chose him. Because he was born a Kain. And because he was born a Kain, so this is a direct gift. Avedis Matana, Etin Kunaschem Yisrael can never become a Kain, as hard as he'll try. There's a certain similarity to that, because Alter Rebbe brings Avedis Matana to Etin Kunaschem. Alter Rebbe is not contrasting the Kain and Yisrael directly over here, but this is a certain similarity. There's something that I build up based on my appreciation, my understanding. There's something which comes directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's emes, this is coming from the Creator himself. There is not only, it's a step and a notch ahead, a notch above, but as he says, Ein Arech Klal, we can appreciate there's no comparison to this which is a production of human intellect to this which comes directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is called true emes. Because the seal, Ignizia of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is emes. Emes Amiti, he is the truth of all truths. Most truthful truth. That's Tanya, Emes Amiti. Every truth which exists within creation, is insignificant in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like creation itself doesn't have any significance. Now let's not take it out of context. Creation has significance because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it, and there's a purpose in creation, particularly this finite world. Of course, there is the purpose which exists, which with inherent with even Elam Haza, because it connects into the country, but more than the supreme Elamist world, as the Rebbe writes in Perek Lamed Zayin, in Lamed Vav, in Lamed Zayin, where he speaks about, starting from Lamed Vav, that is, speaks about the purpose of creation. So of course it has significance, but the Elam itself on its own, the world itself on its own, because in the end of the day, it's coming from the facade, which is called Shem Elokim, Malchus, Adnos, Gvura, again, all elaborated in the Shariach Ve'emunah. It's not the from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the world does not exist. Shem Havayit, nothing does exist, nothing finite could exist in the face of the infinite. And the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there. And that's why famous Atu Achol we explain this so many times, Atu Mishneh B'Elam, which we say before davening. It's not that when Hashem created the before Hashem created the world, it was only HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We should know about only HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Atu. And then, after Hashem creates the world, there is another entity. There's a world. Hashem is in charge of the world. Hashem is in control of the world. Everything, every smallest detail within Olam is all dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and existing because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Hashem is in control, thus Hashem is in control of everything. But still, it's a reality. Before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the world, was only one entity, Hashem, and now there's two. The answer is there's no two. It's Ato Acholeni B'Elam. It's the same Ato. Nothing exists on the face of the infinity, but you see a world. That's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu put on this facade, which is called Shem Elikim, Malchus, again, all explained and elaborated in Shariach Ve'emunah, but it's not the emes. And that gives a room for Eilamis. We gave the example so many times. This great teacher, this great master, it takes upon himself to teach a child as an example. A child in age or a child in stage means that someone who's devoid of any intellect. Taida intellect is an example. And he goes and he understands that if he's going to convey the message or the information the way he appreciates the information, nothing will ever be absorbed by this student, ever just going to go straight over them, because he's not a cave, he's not a container to understand the depth of the way the master understands. It's a piece of Gemara as an example, Torah scholar. So what does he do? He puts different contracts, that the way he appreciates the study, puts on different layers in other words, to try to teaspoon it to the child. And sometimes he even says a story, a mashal, which is a metaphor, and an example, just to the child, to capture the child's mind, the student's mind, and through that he allows, he feeds the message coming through. That's the point of a mashal. The mashal has a nimshal. Why do you need the mashal? Say the nimshal. Say the message in the onset. Why do you need the example? Why do you have to say a story? The answer is because it will say the message, not necessarily it'll be appreciated or understood. So I say that I give a metaphor, and in the metaphor I try to formulate the message that the one who's listening to the story should go, that's what you mean. And so on and so forth, different metaphors and different matters of teaching, different tactics. All this is not the master, the way he has formed himself by himself, the way he studies that same study, because now he's dealing with another party. So someone's going to walk into the room and hear this man doesn't know that this master is a great Torah scholar, and he's going to think, probably what a great storyteller, or even the student itself would say, what a great storyteller. He probably is someone who knows how to convey a matter in a beautiful anecdote and a story and a metaphor for that matter. The greater the chacham, the more you could establish these different examples to this what you want to learn. In other words, to bring it to a lower level in order that someone else should appreciate and understand. Famously we're not going to go into it now. So the student hears a beautiful story. If he starts portraying this master as a storyteller, he got it all wrong. And for that matter, the master is not a storyteller. He can be a nice storyteller. He can have the right tools to be the teacher. But who he is, and more so, even when he's saying that metaphor, it's not that he's lost in that level of appreciating the insight into the story, into the metaphor. No, at the very moment he has all the information as he's saying that metaphor, all the information, in other words, the nimshal, the message, the depth is right there. He never becomes a storyteller. He never degrades to the level of a storyteller. At that moment, that's the point that even when Hashem created the world, there's no two entities, because in the face of the infinite, the finite does not exist, and even after it's created, it still doesn't exist in the face of the purity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the pure infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts on this facade, like the master, he puts on a facade that it should appear that it's a different idea, a story, in this case, a world appears. Because as opposed to the, and I'll right there in Shaykh, more the shame, the difference of Shem Havai and Shem Elikim. Shem Shem Mugin Hashem Elikim. The soul could be too hot, so there's the mugging, the shield over the soul, over the sun, that is, which allows the sun to be appreciated down below. It's warmth, it's brightness, but if there wouldn't be the shield, it would be too much overwhelming. And that's a sun. You're talking about an extra dosage of heat, which would consume everything in the face of the sun, stands in the way of the sun. Much more so you're talking about the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing can exist. So you have the mugging, just like the Shemesh mugging, which allows the sun should be appreciated below. So too there's the Shem Elokim, which covers up of the unadulterated purity of Shem Havai, in order that a world should be created. But from the perspective of the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even after the world was created, they don't exist. So Alter Rebbe says, if the worlds don't exist, nothing in the face of Creator. So the Alter Rebbe uses the same idea, that all the emes of the Nivroim is also kol chashivi kamei. The truth which exists within creation is also insignificant in the face of the truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because this is the truth of a created being. And this is the truth of a creator. Of course, it does not exist. It's just Hashem allowed creation to come into place, and creation should find its own truth. So from the perspective of creation, of course, there's the sheker within creation. The Elam Hazeh is called Elam HaSheker, and if there's truth within creation, it's wonderful. It should be applauded. It should be celebrated. But because it comes from creation, in comparison of Creator, it's kol chashiv, it's insignificant. So this is when you have the Ava V'Yira coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the true absolute emes. There is no comparison to anything which could be built based on the meditation of the human being as a created being. So the Rebbe continues how. So this is the matana which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for the Yid, but the Yid has to have a schus to reach the emes Hashem because it's so lofty, it's so distinctive, it's so distant from the whole makeup, from the whole reality of the world of the human being, which is based in Olam and in Olam Hazeh Gashmi, Chumri, physical, mundane, Olam HaSheker. So how is a man able to merit to the emes Hashem? So the first thing is, you do yours. In other words, he asked the question, how does man merit to this emes Hashem? So he says the first thing is through that you arouse the great pity and mercy and compassion in front of Hashem, in the face of Hashem, on the spark within your soul, Yaakov, which is the attribute of Yaakov, which on his own has a certain emes, or Yaakov is emes. That's the point of Tiferes, like we said. It has a bit of chesed, a bit of gvura. It's not limited to one kav, to one line, meaning to say one expression. It's a combination of two, so it does carry a certain emes. And this is what Yaakov and Mabriach mi'akotze lakotze, from one end to the other, which is mirei mamaylis ad lamata mata, from the highest of heights to the lowest of lows. To draw the truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to this lowly world, which is dark, which is an opaque world. As I sit in darkness, Hashem is going to be a light to me. And that's what says Hashem's kindness prevailed, it overcame. And what Al Rebbe is basically saying, going back to that which Al Rebbe began, the idea of Mamidas Rachmanis and Avedis Hashem. Al Rebbe invested so much of this chapter. The person understanding where his neshama came from, and what a great Rachmanis it is on his neshama. So that arousal of this Rachmanis, of this compassion, that is a certain level, a certain expression associated with emes, which should draw the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into the world and down into the person. Because everything with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is midah keneged midah. This measure per measure, which means it's reciprocal. The Yid does a certain idea, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu reciprocates in that with very fashion and manner. In this case, the Yid arouses his emes. But what kind of emes exists with the Yid? He says the midah b'rachmanis, this idea itself, because which is the midah of rachmanis. On my neshama, there's a certain emes. Why is there a certain emes? Because that's what rachmanis is all about. And this is what Yaakov is all about. Yaakov is Tiferes. Again, it's not limited to the chesed, not limited to the gvura. We explained in the beginning the whole idea of compassion, that it's a combination of both chesed and gvura. Again, as explained in the very beginning of this chapter, chesed, there's no discipline in chesed. Chesed is just giving. The Rebbe famously brings the proof of Avraham Avinu. He felt that the extension of himself would be Yishmael. It's all good because Chesed said there's no limitation. Gvur is all about discipline. Rachmanis, what is Rachmanis by definition? I don't want to go into the whole thing now, but because we explained it. But the whole idea of Rachmanis is, I see there's room for discipline, but nonetheless, I'm extending myself to you. I have compassion over you. So therein, the makeup, the makeup of Tiferes itself is about emes. And Tiferes is about Rachmanos, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, which is Rachmanos, which is the idea, that's why it's called Tiferes. Because the idea of beauty is when you have two colors, not limited to one. Something multicolorful is, in other words, the two colors is a certain beauty over one, because it's not limited to one kav, to one expression. So that is what Yaakov is. And Avedis Hashem, this arousal of Rachmanos is the truth, most greatest truth which the human being could experience on their own. The arousal of the compassion over the neshama. The neshama came from the highest of heights, the uppermost levels within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the nethermost levels of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the lowest of the lows. That is an expression of emes because it's associated with Rachmanis. Rachmanis is all about the emes, as we explained, and that causes HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you have the reciprocation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the matan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is be'ein hareich, which is infinitely greater, and no comparison. But nonetheless, this is what I can do. I'm, in the end of the day, part of creation, and because I'm part of creation, of course I have a neshama, but I work via the reality of creation. So what can I do? I could draw the Hashem's emes, which is be'ein hareich. But at least what I can do is to do something to arouse that emes. And that is the arousal of Midah Rachmanis. And what happens then Eisha b'cheisha, that even I sit in darkness, Hashem becomes my light. Hashem reciprocates with His air, which is His emes. And that's why it says, Gover aleinu chasdei. Not just Hashem extends chesed. It had to be it had to overcome. It had to endure. It had to prevail. Or rather, it had to prevail. Hashem's chesed had to prevail. Why? Because it had to come through, it had to be pushed through. Which, because you're talking about the emes of Hashem to penetrate into emes, into creation. Yeah, that's a very difficult task. But nonetheless, Hashem does work measure for measure. So when we arouse our emes, which by definition is not an absolute emes because it's part of creation, that causes Hashem to come through, to prevail. This chesed would prevail and come down and connect to the person, that the person has the chisame, which means the seal, he has the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way it's manifest in Ava V'yira, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's gift of love and fear, meaning to say that a person has that chip, that program, so to say, coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you put that into your hard drive. It's a different type of expression, different type of program, different type of expression, because you're talking with the gift directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Creator, which with everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu is emes, is absolute truth. So we have the ability to connect with true, genuine love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, true, genuine reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and a reverent love, Ava B'yira, love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming directly as a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem puts in that chip into our hearts. Now it's a different love, a different fear. Of course it is. The Rebbe has it famously in Anila Deidi, in Maimer of Elul Maimer. He says, B'chlal, every love and fear of a Yid comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A Yid experience B'chal comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As a Yid who has 2 feet on the ground. To say that a Yid does what Hashem wants him to do, okay, the Yid compels himself. He's not in the mood, he learns Torah anyways. He's not in the mood, he buys a nice mezuzah anyways. Or he doesn't want to splurge on a nice mezuzah, he compels himself. Should have not put in a nice pair of tefillin and make sure to put it on time and so on, and put it on correct. Yeah, that a person could compel himself to do. But love and fear, you're sitting in Elam Hazin, you're loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, fearing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Salter Rebbe says B'chlal, that it itself comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Do the math, as Salter Rebbe doesn't say that, but basically you're in Elam Hazin, you love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm going to love, true love, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm not talking about the badge of love. I'm an Ohev Hashem, I'm a Yarei Hashem. It's not even to be dignified. We're talking about a love and a true sensation of love, like the famous Rambam actually in Chesed. He speaks of love. He becomes very specific, and he says, "You love something. So somebody." He says, "Ka'ava say Isha." Famous Rambam in Chesed. When a person loves, he doesn't remove his mind from this party, this idea that he loved. This is a true heart sensation. It's not says you have a heart sensation towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu when you're in Elam Hazeh, that it has to come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But there doesn't directly differentiate. Doesn't say exactly this word. You could definitely make the connection. But here the Alter Rebbe says, yeah, you could arouse it as well. We have the ability to do so because we have a mind. And that mind is not just the mind of a human being. A mind of a human being with the energy of a chelik of the kamimal, part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So everyone's going to ask, that's part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so what's the difference? No, in the end of the day, Neshama, so Alter Rebbe writes many times in Kuditei, it becomes a nivra, adapts to creation, one way or another. It works through creation, because especially it's invested in a body and an animal soul. So it could work out, it could definitely ponder the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and arouse, again, a true and genuine love. It is true, it is genuine. It's not something just in a Yiddish expression, gemachta ava. No, it's true, it's genuine, and it's something which is, a true production of my conspicuous clarity, at least with my ability to on the realities of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. A person has clarity, that information. Hero Israel, Lashon Yiddish, derhert. He understands, he appreciates it deeply. Hashem is Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Of course, at least the V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, the true love, a true, genuine love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then Yiras Hashem, revering of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But nonetheless, you can't compare that to the Ava B'yira coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, from the Creator. And Hashem puts that into Hashem Li. Ki Gover Aleinu Chazdei. Hashem is able to overcome so to say, this boundary between creation and creator, and he puts that chip into our hearts. Whoa, that's a different love. That's a different story. That's a different game. Different love, a different fear, and so on. So the Rebbe goes back and says, he says, okay, so you're doing something which has the midah of emes. You're arousing the rachmanis, not only chesed and gvura, which is ava v'yira. You're dealing with a midah of emes, which is midah of rachmanis. Okay, and that's supposed to trigger Hashem's emes. But are you doing it with truth? And because you, as part of creation, does not have the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so how could, in the end of the day, you be able to elicit the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? As the Alter Rebbe says, Hashem has to also be be'emes. And v'gam she'be'emes shalei, it's your emes. Ech yuchalai de emes shalei, le'rachem aliyim, emes Hashem. How, through your emes, are you able to arouse the supreme mercy of emes Hashem, from the true emes of Hashem, the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a mercy which produces a avo, and a yiro, again, directly coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Matana, Vedas Matana, Etinis Kanam is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, carries the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could that be? So, when Alter Rebbe asks over here, didn't he just say that there's something measure per measure, you do yours, and for that matter, it says a number of places, Maybe she says, your absolute, so to say, might, which means love HaKadosh Baruch Hu with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and it says so many places, Kabbalah and Chassidus, based on the Gemara even, first parsha, second parsha, which does not have B'chol Ma'itchem. Ma'itchem means with all your might, with your absolute, you're giving away your absolute devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But nonetheless, it's still Ma'itcha. Can't compare it to the Ma'id of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's for sure not. As we learn over here. Not even no need to elaborate. But sometimes even comparison to another party, but the other party that's already part of his default Aveda. And the other party, his whole might, is a different Ma'itcha. That's why Hashem says Ma'itcha. Because this, in the end of the day, it's your Ma'itcha. For that matter, it's not only in comparison to another party, sometimes even the person himself. Today's Ma'id is tomorrow's norm. And that's why it's demanded from a person, Yelchu Machayel Chayel, to constantly climb, to enter into a new Ma'id. So it's not an absolute Ma'id. It's commensurate with where the parties of the Yid serve HaKadosh Baruch. So where's the real Ma'id? If it's just a relative type of Ma'id, so the Chassidus explains, that's in the end of the day what Hashem wants. Right now, that's your Ma'idcha. It's your absolute devotion. It's your absolute Ibrigegemkeit, which is the expression in Yiddish, which means your love, your fear, everything about your submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's with all your might. That's able to arouse HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Ma'id, the deepest levels within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ma'idcha, I just want yours, your present Ma'id, which is what Alter Rebbe is saying in the beginning. And you're trying to use a midah b'rachmanus, it's midah emes, in order to drive HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ma'emes, the emes of Hashem, the avavira associated with the emes of Hashem. So it makes sense, but Alter Rebbe still says that ultimately, so what's that going to be? Or doesn't Hashem establish that? But the answer is like this: when you want to take something from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for example, it says a Chassidus, a person is able to arouse the ma'id of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a deeper part within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, there's so many explanations on this. What does it mean? The deeper part within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but b'pashtos, simply, it's like the relation of two people. You did something to touch another party. You triggered something deeper than the norm, and the person has a desire to reciprocate from that inward area within his soul and his heart that you touch because you express yourself a little deeper, or with a greater expression of devotion, whatever the case may be, whatever the relationship that may be. And so too, you reach with a deeper part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So why isn't it enough over here as an explanation to why is Alter Rebbe go back and ask this question? Who says with your emes, could your emes is still a limited emes, and how could you draw the absolute emes? And the answer is because we're not talking about another part within a deeper part within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're talking about the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're talking about the absolute, the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. It's It's not just a deeper level, it's the entire truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu you want to bring down to this world, because you're arousing this Rahmanis, which is about emes, and you're trying, of course, to do it in an emes way, in a truth way, but in the end of the day, to have the emes of Hashem, and not necessarily you're doing it with the absolute emes. Why aren't you doing that as absolute emes? Because you're part of creation, which does not have absolute emes built into your system, because you're part of creation, and it's impossible that creation should have anything truly absolute, especially the absolute emes. Alter Rebbe said, Alter Rebbe asked, Am Em Shalei, how could you, through your Em Shalei, to arouse the Rachmel Yenim, me emes Hashem, from the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the special matan, the special gift, coming directly from the Creator. It says, the suggestion is the midah, the character, literally means the execution of tzedakah, and to allow the character of giving to be executed, to be implemented, to be expressed, which is the actual giving charity. When you give charity, there's a certain emes, which that emes is able to touch the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to draw the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why so? And if we do that, do we need the first Aved of emes? First of all, of course we need the first Aved of emes, because that's where the heart comes in, which of course that elicits the on high. The question is to have the absolute emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Alter Rebbe says, give tzedakah. What is it with giving tzedakah? Because when you give tzedakah, is that this is something that you're doing, there's something like a blind type of action. Not exactly, not to take it out of context, because the other person is in need and you have, and to the contrary, especially as Teda looks at the mitzvah of tzedakah, that's why tzedakah is really not translated as charity. Tzedakah is translated as justice. You have, the other party doesn't have. So of course you have to give it to them. And Allah Hashem gave it to you in order to give it to the other party. He made you the good messenger. Like David HaMelech says, Mishulcha nasanulach. I'm giving back to, in other words, he tried to categorize the mitzvah tzedakah. He says, from you, I'm giving to you. It's all yours. You gave it to me just to pass it on to the poor. That's why it's called tzedakah. Explained this the other day, I think even in this chapter perhaps. But if you think about tzedakah, is that I have, and I'm just blindly giving to the poor. Meaning to say, he's poor, he's vulnerable. He has no connection to me. Not in a nasty or negative way. The giver is comfortable, and the poor is destitute. He's needy. What do? I just take from myself and just give. So I'm doing something somewhat disproportionate, if you can understand what we're saying here. Disproportionate because he's not living on my plane. It's not about ego or so, which is again doesn't stand a chance. It doesn't stand any. There's no justification to have any feelings good about the fact that you are not in his or her state, because Hashem gave you that blessing that you're not, for whatever reason. The famous Bart, I think, that about Shabbat and Marash, the Ani understands has to be the rich and the poor, but he asks Hashem, why was I chosen to be the poor? He understands that's the way the world runs. Mashpia and Mekabel, giving and taking, the giver and the taker, the usher and the ani, the rich and the poor. So the poor, the true tamim, means that someone who's aligned with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, never questions about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He understands. The person understands there has to be. This is the way Hashem created the world. But he says, why was I chosen to be the poor? Could have been the other way around. Because the poor is by definition, it's not just like someone has a little more, someone has more. Especially when you're talking about someone who's not only an ani, he's an eved, he's destitute. And I take part of my wealth and I drop it into him. I'm doing something and causing a big change over here. It's a kind of a quantum leap. So it's not something gradual. Like, okay, I'm doing and giving you a little tzedakah, or I'm learning a little more Torah, or putting up a mezuzah. This is something that I'm taking of my wealth and dropping into the person and say, that's it. No more poor, no more poverty, no more destitution. You're going to have what you need. That causes Hashem to do the same. Why is he giving us his emes? Because we're poor and we're destitute. Because we're part of creation. And on our own, we can't reach that level of the emes Hashem. We have it's a total disconnect, because we're part of creation and we're talking about the emes of the Creator. So we're beyond poor. For that matter, the distance of the richest person or the poorest person, and is never compared to the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the emes of creation. But this is real beirei, be'ein arech. There's no such thing be'ein arech. True be'ein arech doesn't exist in this world. Yeah, you could use that term of be'ein arech, which means non-comparison. And someone's a multi-billionaire, and someone doesn't have the few pennies to buy a bagel. Something is non-comparison. You can use justifiably the word non-comparison, but in essence, a few more dollars, a few more pennies is $1, and $1 is $10 is 10 of those dollars is 10, and another 10 is 100, and another 10 is 1,000, and another 10 is a million, is 10,000, another 10 is 100, and another 10 is a million, and that's a billion. It's all commensurate one way or another. Because Baruch Hu is truly ein arech, because there's no comparison finite to the infinite. So the difference of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's emes to our emes is much greater, much more distant than our situation to the situation of the poor, or the situation of the rich and the situation of the poor. But when I do that, take that quantum leap step, and I say, that's mine, but take it, Hashem does the same. He extends from His emes to us. So the arousal of the Rachmanis and Avodas Hashem, of course, is essential and crucial, because that's the experience itself which draws Hashem's emes. Because we're talking about the emotional Abba V'yira, which Hashem is able to extend to the person. We're talking about the matana. In this case, what is the matana? Matana is the love and fear. Matana is about the emotive expressions and direction of our emotions towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So of course there has to be the Hisayus of Rachmim, which Rachmim is emes, because you're talking about the Hisayus of Rachmim, which leads to Abba V'yira, Li'akam Hashipad V'Sabro, leads to fear and love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So of course that has to be. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu reciprocates, and He starts extending. He wants to extend His Abba V'yira, His matana of Abba V'yira to the Yid. Rachmanis and Abba V'yira to the Yid. Which is, of course, associated with the Ein Sof, the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why it's a gift. We cannot reach there on our own. It's coming directly from the Creator. But what, so to say, pushes it over the edge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to take of His emes to the Nivraim that don't have absolute emes, is when we give tzedakah. We just, there's no connection. This person is wealthy, this person is very poor, and I just take a bunch of the money and I give it to the poor. Hashem does the same. Takes from His emes and drops it into us, and puts it in a stab. It drops it, means that He makes sure it fits, doesn't just drop it. That the person's heart could truly ignite with a very distinct type of love to Hashem, very distinct reverence, awe, and fear of Hashem. So this is the idea of midat tzedakah. So what is the suggestion? Midat tzedakah, the attribute, which means the execution, ultimately the execution of tzedakah, coming from the midah of rachamim, the midah of mercy, which is again the usual compelling reason why would someone give tzedakah. It's called the midah of tzedakah. Someone doesn't have anything. To give life to the spirit of the lowly, meaning to say the poor and the destitute, etc. When we arouse, we do have that arousal below. And when we give this, we extend ourselves to the poor, to the vulnerable. Hashem does the same. Of course, what Yisarus Leila are we talking about over here? This midah of emes, that Hashem is meiri shenim. He arouses those who sleep, or in a deep sleep. Will make it nirdamim. He wakes up those who are in a slumber, which is the state of the neshama Rahman and Slan in Ilam Hazeh. It's a sleep and slumber state, dormant, as we spoke about in the beginning of the chapter. That's why it is a Rahmanas on the neshama. That's why the Yid himself is able to as well arouse this Rahmanas on the neshama. But Hashem comes in with His matana, with His gifts. Of course, that is really what arouses the Yid from his sleep and slumber, and this comes from Rachmim Rabim V'Chasadim El Yenim. In other words, the sleep and slumber. Of course, we're talking about an Avodas Hashem, as we spoke about and explained at the very beginning of the chapter, and El Tereb explained so beautifully in what we say in Ameir La'oretz, that Melech HaMerim L'Bad HaMiyoz, But nonetheless, Hadeinu Zenu, and the Eibishter gives Kayach, he comes in, and in this case, we're talking about ultimately the Surah the absolute Abba V'yira of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the absolute Emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, comes in and right away, of course, does immediately the job in a total different level, arouses from sleep and from slumber, and that comes from the Rachmim Rabim Chasadim Eliyim. This comes from the great and enormous mercy, and then the supreme kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is usually ne'elamim, which is usually concealed, lotzes me'elam lagili, to come out, to emerge from the state of concealment to the state of revelation. Ha'or rabba, and great light, loyer be'rachayim, to illuminate with the light of life, emes Hashem la'elam, the truth of Hashem la'elam. For that matter, Alter was of course quoting the pasuk, which is say in Hallel, which is in Tehillim, ve'emes Hashem la'elam. Whoa, that's a big decision. That the emes Hashem should touch down into Eilam, you can't think of anything so extreme from one to the other. In other words, so far apart of the emes Hashem to the Eilam, but yeah, that's what this does. There's the fusion of the emes Hashem. The Eibishter comes in to shine with his great light. And what happens is that this emes Hashem, this absolute emes of Hashem, absolute emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, comes down la'elam into this world, which is the greatest accomplishment, the greatest deal. It's a gigavar aleinu chasdei. Hashem prevails. Hashem's chesed prevails because, of course, diametrically distant, opposite. Eilam, lashon helam v'hester, concealed over the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore creation takes formation because there is the Helam V'Hester of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course by design of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but that's what Eilam is. And then you have the absolute Emes Hashem, the absolute Emes of a creator, that could be fused together with Eilam. Yeah, that's Gover Aleinu Chazdei, and that's when he does he rouses his midah of Emes, which is midah of Rachmanis. And he gives staka to the poor to allow the Hashem to make that decision that there should be the emes Hashem la'elam. Now we can understand what the pasuk says. Titein emes liYaakov, that even Yaakov, which is about the midah of emes, midah of rachmanis, also he needs that special titein, the special giving of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The matan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even as Alter Rebbe says, Yaakov is emes. The midah of Yaakov is emes, and Alter Rebbe shows the end this emes of Rabbeinu Hashem, which is the arousal of the Rachmanis of the Hashem again, precisely Rachmanis more than the Abba V'yira, because Rachmanis is about the midah of emes. So what do we need Hashem's emes? And the answer is it's a different type of emes, it's a different type of truth, it's a different type of Abba, it's a different type of yira. In other words, it's a different type of love, it's a different type of fear coming directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a gift. Titein emes liYaakov. It's quite clear. That even Yaakov, which is midah of emes, but Yaakov midah of emes, not Yaakov. Yaakov was a godly person, but the emes of Yaakov, which he is the Avis, the forefathers, which one of the choices rather of the forefathers, and the whole point of the forefathers were to extend from themselves to their offsprings, and ultimately for Am Yisrael, and for in all generations, that they should have the character which they were uniquely all about, and were not only excellent in, for example, Avraham Avinu, the midah of Ava, the midah of Chesed. It's not that Avraham Avinu, of course, it was in a different plane, but Avraham Maisi of a similar body, it's supposed to extend itself to the descendants of Avraham Avinu, towards all times and all generations. That a Yid can have Abbas Hashem, love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Yitzchak, fear, reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yaakov Rachmanis. But in the end of the day, this midah of Yaakov that we reflect in any Yid, which is descendant of Yaakov Avinu, is of course a limited type of emes, because it's emes of creation. Therefore, we ask Titein emes liYaakov, that we should be able to have the absolute emes as a matan, of course, to Yaakov. Even though Yaakov is about emes, even though this midah is about emes. Therefore, when it comes to charity, it says the loshin of sowing, which Alter is going back to the very first words of the Pedic, which Alter namely was explaining, this pasuk Zeriat Tzedakah Seichar Emes, that when you sow charity, the reward is Emes. And again, there's the Pirush HaPashut, the simple meaning, which is again, go not to repeat it over here. Go if you want to go to the beginning of the chapter, it's a click away. We quoted then that Rashi and Mitzvah David and Bechlal. This is the simple meaning that the final truth, the reward. You do something and somewhat the reward is not going. This is the situation with Am Yisrael throughout all generations. Like knew what's going on, and Hashem decides that when we sow tzedakah, we're going to finally have that truth of the reward. It means the reward will come through. But Dal Rebbe says no, a different pirush rather. He says it's the seicher, the schar itself is emes. That when you sow tzedakah, the secher, which is the schar, the reward, is not that the truth is going to come, is going to be manifest, and therefore you'll have reward and everything you need, spiritual reward or physical, and every area of need. In other words, we live and use human beings, or spiritual reward that I'll be able to daven better. All good. And that's the simple meaning of Sechar Emes. But Alter Rebbe says, no, if you look at the pasuk, it says Sechar Emes means the reward is the mid of Emes. The Emes, Hashem is extending His Emes, His absolute Emes to you. And this is why we say the Lashon Zriya by Tzedakah, sowing, because what do we have to do? We have to latzmiach. We're talking about sprouting the supreme Emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Emes Hashem. Like we just said, giving tzedakah. Matzmiach emes. Zeriat tzedakah the secher emes. Because this is what we're talking about. So why use that terminology? Because that's the whole point of what Alter Rebbe is saying over here. When you give tzedakah, you have the measure per measure. Hashem is really just right now extending Himself. In other words, the reciprocation is something which works, so to say, instinctively, if you will. There's a certain inevitability over here because that's the way Hashem decided. You give to the poor, to the vulnerable. You take that quantum leap step. You take from your wealth and you drop it to the poor, to the destitute. That right away triggers HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do the same. He's ready to take His emes and give it to you. Emes Hashem la'olam. That grand, important step. That's why we have the idea of Zriya. The expression of Zriya, which is sowing. Because you sow, it's not just like, you sow something mechanical, I'm going to sow, like I push a button over here, something's going to come out. No, sowing triggers the earth to ultimately establish production. And this is what tzedakah does. It triggers HaKadosh Baruch Hu to establish this production. In other words, to draw the emes, this absolute emes, to nivra, to you as a nivra, as a created being, and ultimately, emes Hashem la'elah. Alter Rebbe concludes over here, particularly when you do charity and kindness of truth with the holy land of Eretz Yisrael. He speaks about it. Blessed is the occasion that it should be erected speedily in our days. Amen. The kain to fulfill what it says, emes mi eretz titzmach. That emes will sprout from the land. So this has other medrash that Hashem took emes and threw it in the land because emes said, "Don't create the world." I'm not going to go through this whole medrash. There was an argument with emes and chesed. Chesed said Hashem. Chesed said, "Okay, create the world. This is a world of kindness. Elam chesed yibana." There's a lot of kindness which exists in this world. There should be a bit more, but there is. It exists from the perspective of chesed. Perfect. If it's even less than perfect. It could be more perfect, but there's room for the creation of the world. Emes said, you're kidding? This world is an Elam HaSheker. There's nothing emes of Elam Haza. As we all know, it's need not to explain, need not to elaborate. So Emes said, what are you kidding? What are you creating this world for? It's an Elam HaSheker. From the perspective of the world, the emes, from the perspective of Emes, the world could not exist. So Emes Amar Al Yivra, don't create. Hashem took the emes and threw it down. The famous pasuk. can't remember the pasuk, it went blank over here. Hashem taking the emes and throwing it, and eventually the emes is on the land and on the ground and penetrates into the ground, and eventually it starts shooting up its own roots. It starts introducing the emes into the world of sheker, which usually is accomplished by the yid, which is also the idea of the fusion of emes with Eilam, because the emes starts sprouting its roots based on the Lashon again of Hashem taking the emes and throwing it down. Just it'll come back, hopefully come back to me this pasuk, but Akopanim, the emes starts sprouting its own roots. And eventually it starts taking over. We have a world which is by definition El Mashech, it becomes a world of emes. Because it's still even though we're entering into the highest time for Geula, nonetheless, so much unfortunate sheker there, but emes will come through. B'chlolis in general, things sometimes take a bit more time, and the sheker could stand for so long, but not beyond that. In every particular story, sometimes it's so hurting because it's so full of untruth. There's so much untruth in this scenario, that scenario, and it hurts people, and it becomes messy. But eventually, the emes that's sprouting, and everything becomes clear, and it works individually and collectively in big things and grand things. And we look around the world today. Things sometimes, unfortunately, took years. Eventually, a certain emes just made its way through, and that was years of lies, as an example. And again, in the grander matters which exist, again, they're grand because you're dealing with truly grand matters and grand parts of this world and superpowers and so on. I'm not going to go into it now, but it works individually also. The person sometimes struggles because there's a certain inconsistency which exists, and the emes in the end that makes its way through, and that will happen when Mashiach will come, and all the sheker the light will open up. So that's what's one of the pirushim of emes meretz titzmach. But Alter Rebbe teaches emes meretz titzmach here, referring, when you say eretz, it's referring to Eretz Yisrael. And as I say this whole medrash, because when we think of eretz meretz titzmach, we think about that medrash, but not to go off. Alter Rebbe is not talking about the medrash now, which we just mentioned. Alter Rebbe is saying that to plant the tzedakah, between planting tzedakah everywhere else in the world or in Eretz Yisrael, there is an advantage, and a great advantage of planting tzedakah in Eretz Yisrael, because emes me eretz titzmach, from Eretz Yisrael, this emes will sprout. And what emes are we talking about? The emes Hashem, which is the matana, the special gift what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for the Yid individually and collectively for Am Yisrael, through Zriyas HaTzedakah Ba, through sowing tzedakah in it. And of course, to re-mention, maybe even right over here, many of these Igeres HaKadosh, we spoke about it in this past, even though this segment is distinct, that it's not sequential. Every letter is separate based on a certain time, a certain circumstance, set to a certain community or certain communities, even though in the end of the day something penned by the Alter Rebbe is timeless and has its eternal message. But nonetheless, each letter is separate. But we did say that if you could draw a thread or try to find a thread between all the message of all the entire Igeres HaKodesh, even though there's certain letters which the Alter Rebbe doesn't even mention the idea of tzedakah, but nonetheless, you can definitely understand and appreciate the Alter Rebbe's inimitable presentation of this unique and explanation, like nobody else. The Rebbe has this whole idea of the fifth and the beyond the fifth within tzedakah, because it's a different idea. It's not only from the perspective of tzedakah, it's about tikkun. I mean, the Alter Rebbe's explanation and presentation of tzedakah is like, it is enormous, unique. It's a game changer. It's a revolutionary appreciation of difference of our appreciation of tzedakah prior to learning Igeres HaKodesh. But one thing is clear. Again, you can gather from all the Igeres HaKodesh, the Alter Rebbe, in other words, the most central message in Igeres HaKodesh is the mitzvah of tzedakah. But again, there's backdrop to this whole appeal, because the Alter Rebbe was famously supporting, or had a huge campaign throughout, from the time that his Talmud Chaver, considered him as one of his master also, even though, namely, the Alter Rebbe's master was Mizitch Magid, but he was the oldest Talmud of Mizitch Magid. The Alter Rebbe was the youngest. The Alter Rebbe had a certain inner respect to him, and namely when he famously made the Aliyah with so many Chassidim to Eretz Yisrael, and in the end of the day, they went through a very, very difficult time. Mendel himself and all his followers. The poverty there, today it's written so much about it. You have to change from one place to the other just to be able to make ends meet. And the Alter Rebbe knew about this, and the Alter Rebbe took it upon himself. So the Alter Rebbe felt it was so natural to send funds to Eretz Yisrael, which then was under the Turkish Empire, in order to support Reb Mendel and his Chassidim. It's famous, again, Aliyah of Reb Mendel Haradoker at that time, and again with his followers. So the Alter Rebbe in this case also, you see in this chapter, you find in many of the chapters, the Alter Rebbe mentions Eretz HaKodesh, because this is again the campaign of the Alter Rebbe in the tzedakah towards Eretz HaKodesh, towards this group. And here the Alter Rebbe again, so the Alter Rebbe speaks about tzedakah. He says, "Emes mi eretz titzmach." You want it to go quicker. You want that emes to come, that matana HaKadosh Baruch Hu go quicker, planted additional to giving tzedakah, which also elicits that emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, giving tzedakah in Eretz HaKodesh. Bo in Eretz HaKodesh, v'chesed v'rachman rabim v'nisofi min lukotim l'seicha, the kindness and the enormous mercy and compassion which is gathered and absorbed in Eretz Yisrael, they also additionally arouse the supreme kindness, which is hidden in it, like it says that you hid, you embedded, you hid, in order to erect and to establish Eretz Yisrael, like it says, b'tzedakah tekineni, that tzedakah, the Eretz Yisrael itself says that with tzedakah you will erect me, because there's so much inherent kedusha in Eretz Yisrael. As the Alter Rebbe writes, Zeh Sha'ar HaShamayim, that the Eretz Yisrael, particularly Yerushalayim, physical Yerushalayim, has the direct link to the Yerushalayim Shel Maila. This is what we're trying to arouse. As the Alter Rebbe explains another memorim, it's precisely through that channel of the Yerushalayim Shel Maila that we were able to elicit all these brachas, and in this case the Emes Hashem. So when we give it to Eretz Yisrael, the Alter Rebbe's lashon is there's nothing which is interfering the sha'arim, in other words, the flow between the Yerushalayim Shel Mata, Yerushalayim Shel Maila. In this case, the Alter Rebbe similarly says there's so much inherent holiness in Eretz Yisrael and associated with his emes. And therefore, when we plant in Eretz Yisrael, when we give tzedakah towards Eretz Yisrael, this causes the emes of Hashem to come so much quicker. And because this is associated with the enormous energy in Eretz Yisrael itself, so when we plant in Eretz Yisrael, we have the me'eretz titzmach. Eretz Yisrael itself is ultimately erected and is established. So that's why Eretz Yisrael says, "B'tzedakah tekineni, you will erect me."